So, what do we learn about effective witness from the book of Acts? And that's where we want to start today. What do we learn about effective witness from the book of Acts? Effective witness that I would say is true in all times and in all places. Last year I spent a whole lot of time with you talking about how life is so different now and how we need to think about preaching the good news and talking about the good news in a kind of different way. And I still believe all of that. We always have to be sensitive to translate and be the translators of the gospel into the new current age. But there are some things that never change. And here are some of the things that never change and some of the lessons that we learned about from the book of Acts. The first one is this. The good news will never be good news to anyone else unless it's really good news to us. Have you ever been around somebody who has discovered something that changed their life? They're like infomercials, honestly. They just keep talking. You know, wind my son Chip, who is my 28, 29-year-old, whatever he is now. Wind my son Chip up, and it won't take very long before he'll start talking about his iPad. His iPad has changed his life. And, and I just sort of go like this when he starts talking about his iPad. I got to get resistant and so forth. But friends, I got up at 4 a.m. on Friday morning and ordered an iPad too. He finally got through to me. But wind my son Chip up and he'll talk to you about how his iPad has changed his life, how he doesn't even use his laptop anymore, how, that he can run his TV set, he can run everything in his house off his iPad, and how his iPad has just been the best thing as he's it goes on and on and on. Well, and something's changed your life. You begin to talk about it. Now, lest you think that he's a complete idolater, and he's only a partial idolater. Like the rest of us. He's an amazingly godly young man who just whose life and whose ministry just stagger me. I just am so proud of him. But it does change your life. I remember the time, and many of you do too, when Jesus became more than a word to me. I was a freshman in college, and I'd grown up in the church, and I'd had all that kind of background. Grown up as a Lutheran, had done all the Lutheran stuff, had gone through years of catechism, had memorized all of Luther's small catechism, the whole thing. So I knew all this stuff, and yet it had never really taken root in my life. As a college freshman, I went to college thinking, okay, I'm going to finally reinvent my life. I didn't really like the way my life was going. I tried to figure it out in high school, and I couldn't figure it out, and I thought, now is my chance. I'm going away to college. I can start over again. And I went away to college, and the first week I had a revelation. My revelation was, maybe this isn't going to work the way I thought it was going to work, because I took myself with me. And by God's grace and providence, during fraternity rush of all places, my fraternity rush date, who had been the president of the sophomore class and was sort of a big man on campus and so forth, my fraternity rush date, whose name was Sonny Westbrook, took me out on the backyard of the Phi Delta Theta house at Whitman College and sat me down, and while everybody else was playing volleyball, he shared with me about his love for Jesus. And I had never heard another peer whom I trusted, who I admired. I only admired this guy because of the fact that he had a reputation that was admirable. I had never heard a peer whom I admired talk that way about faith in Jesus Christ. And God did something in my life that afternoon. I walked back to my residence hall and walked into my room, and I thought, my life is never going to be the same after today. And it wasn't. And my poor roommate, who I'll tell you about in a few minutes, my poor roommate, whose name was Alan, thought, what in the world has happened? And what have I gotten myself into? Poor Alan. There's often such a gap, you see, between what we say and what we are living into on a daily basis that we sometimes aren't excited about our faith anymore. Instead of being an infomercial, we just push the silent button, the mute button. Or we don't really believe that God will work in someone else's life the way that God has worked in our lives. Do we really believe that the Holy Spirit is still alive and well and at work in people's lives all the time? We as Presbyterians have so domesticated God. We don't like the wild, breaking loose, passionate kind of God. We don't like talking about even the Holy Spirit. We don't like that. We're more intellectual. We like the intellectual God, the sedate God, the Presbyterian God, the philosophical God, the one who's transcendent and immanent and, trans whatevers, but doesn't come too close, that we can kind of define, put in a box. We don't want God to do anything unseemly, out of sorts. We don't want God to ask us to do something that might be tricky or hard or embarrassing. Last week, oh my gosh, did I ever get stabbed? Sometimes God just pokes me in the ribs. You know what that's like? But sometimes God stabs me. Just really, really pokes me. And I was reading Luke 18. It's the parable of the unjust judge. It's about, I won't tell you what the parable is about. The parable is really interesting in itself. And I was actually looking at this parable because I was preparing to do a talk on prayer. But Jesus concludes the parable with this phrase, and I just got poked by it. Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes and returns to the earth, will he find faith? When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? It's a question that Jesus actually frequently asked in his ministry. He frequently characterized the disciples, and I always wonder what they thought about it when he did it. His sort of little pet name for the disciples were, "You little face." And I always think of Jesus sort of smiling and, with that sort of gracious kind of way, but, saying, "Oh, you little face, you little face, you little face." Why? Because most of us don't believe that God will act. We don't really believe that God will change people, that God will show up, that God will heal and forgive and love others the way that God has loved us. How big is your God? How big did God look to the first Christian? Those in the book of Acts, whose lives were absolutely dumped upside down because of God's work. The good news must be personal. And that means hanging around where God is at work. Oh my goodness. I wish you could have been at our Easter service at our little church last Sunday. Since I was with you last, our church has more than doubled in size. And we're still a little church, but we're getting bigger all the time. And it's an amazing thing. But on Easter, it was just amazing. A woman by the name of Karen stood up to talk about what God had done in her life in the last year. What God had done in her life. She lost her father when she was really young, when she was, I think, about 8 or 9. Her father was killed in a very tragic accident. Her mother has been a lifelong alcoholic, and the alcoholism only got worse. And Karen grew up in this environment, and it was a very difficult environment, and she spent her teenage years trying to find love in all the wrong places. When she went off to college, it didn't quit, and she had a brush with alcoholism herself. It was a real struggle. She kept sort of wavering along the way. Her older brother, who had kind of held the family together in the absence of the father and in the presence of this alcoholic mother, had done what he could, but a year before last Easter, Karen found herself pregnant and unwed by a man that she did not love and who did not love her. And it was a terrible thing. And when she told the family thought it was a terrible thing, and people gave her all kinds of advice about what she was going to do. And as far as Karen was concerned, life was ruined. And in the middle of all of that, for her, in her despair, she wondered. She just wondered. That was all it was. It was just enough to wonder whether God could actually redeem even this. And she came to our church, and our church embraced her and welcomed her in. And ultimately she had the baby, and our church walked with her, as in the chapel, not of our church, but of the adoptive parents' church. They had a service. We had a service where she handed the baby to this adoptive parent. And Karen continued to grow. And last Easter, with great confidence, this timid, broken woman stood before our congregation and said, "I know Jesus is alive. Because Jesus is alive in me. And Jesus has changed my life." And this fall, Karen is in seminary. The second thing we looked at in the book of Acts is the good news. The good news will look good only if it is credible. The good news will look good only if it's credible. When others look at us, what do they see? John chapter 13, Jesus says to his disciples, "Now I want you guys to learn to serve and to love one another." That's really important. In fact, Jesus says in John 13, verse 34, "You will know my disciples. You will know my disciples by how they love one another. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, because you love one another." That's how it works. Wow. Amazing. Real love. Loving people who aren't perfect, who aren't full of joy, who aren't full of hope and life, who sometimes think the most unfortunate things. But figuring out what it means to really love one another. And ultimately, then we discover that this real love is the environment in which people begin to grow, an environment in which people begin to develop, in which they see Jesus, in which they begin to understand what it means to have more joy and more hope and more life with a capital L. A fellowship where even death doesn't do them in.